Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books, and I'm very glad to be joined today by a new Orbis author, new to us at least, Mary Frances Coady, who is a Canadian writer and editor. She has written previous books, very interesting book on Thomas Merton and Evelyn Waugh and their collaboration and correspondence around his book, The Seven-Story Mountain. She also edited a book of the uh, letters, prison letters of the German Jesuit Alfred Delp that is absolutely fascinating. Her new book is a biography of Caryll Houselander, English artist, spiritual writer, some would say spiritual master, teacher. Uh, and one of the things that everybody says about Caryll Houselander, one of the first things they do is describe her unusual appearance and how what a peculiar impression she made. I first want to call up the on my screen here the cover of the book, which shows her in 1931, I guess, a self-portrait with a cigarette between her lips, a little rocking horse in the background. We'll maybe describe what the significance of that is. Um, if I could just read the first paragraph of your book. There was a famous biography, in fact, I think it was the previous biography of Caryll Houselander by her publisher, Maisie Ward, with the subtitle The Divine Eccentric. And that seems to be a feature of her personality or persona that everybody stresses, and your book is no exception. You begin with this wonderful paragraph. She looked like a medieval saint, or perhaps a medieval tumbler, who had stepped out of a stained glass window onto the ancient streets of London. Her hair was carrot-colored, cut irregularly in adult years, with a fringe that hung down to her eyebrows. It clashed with the purple smock she donned in her studio. She wore a white substance on her face in adulthood, perhaps a form of cosmetic powder, although another friend said she looked as if she had dipped her face in a bag of flour. As a result, she drew stares. Her round, dark-rimmed glasses sat at a slight angle on her face, giving an off-center look to a small-framed body. Her strange appearance provided the cover for a complex woman who, according to her publisher, had a touch of genius. Um, that's an unusual way to begin a book of about anybody, and yet it seems to be first impressions that she made on people were, even by her own self-definition, she said she felt like she was an oddity or grotesque or peculiar or didn't
Yeah.
fit in with normal company. And yet she had this fantastic personality and a kind of aliveness that made a huge impression on everybody she met. Isn't that right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
What would you say about, her early life and how that shaped her vocation and her personality?
Not much is known about her early life. Uh, she writes about it in one way, in as if it's a lost Eden.
Hmm.
That was the impression that I got from the her book on the Rocking Horse Catholic. On the other hand, there was other unpublished writing that was actually quite it showed a rather disturbed child, and so it's her very early life. It's very hard to tell. I think in one way she wanted it to be like a, a kind of an Eden. On the other hand, there was disturbance because her parents did separate at the age of when she was 11, and so there was some great difficulty in the home, and life changed abruptly for her at that time.
She
And she
in
went
her
to boarding schools
Yeah.
after that. She went to boarding schools.
her memoir, which was one of her last books, was titled "A Rocking Horse Catholic," because she said she wasn't a cradle Catholic. It was kind of striking and unusual that at the age of 7, her parents had her and her sister baptized in the Catholic Church, right?
Yes, her mother.
Her
Yeah, her
mother.
mother made that decision, and it seemed to be under the influence of a priest.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's hard to know kind of what exactly took place there, but yeah, she was a small child, and her mother, yeah, her mother herself did not become a Catholic until later.
Hmm. So she goes to a Catholic boarding school run by some French nuns, I guess.
That's right.
And
At first,
she
yes.
was kind of an outsider there. Didn't, play sports and wasn't an outgoing, kind of child. But it was there that she had the first of what you call unusual psychic encounters or experiences. It was during World War One, and there was a Bavarian, let's say German nun there who was kind of an outsider among the French, and she comes across her on her she's washing the floor or something, and saw tears coming down her this nun's face. And what did she experience or see there?
What she saw was in one place she described, in the Rocking Horse Catholic, she described a crown of thorns on the nun's head. In another piece of writing she did, she described it as a cap of thorns, so that the woman's head, as if she was suffering the sufferings of Christ with the crown of thorns.
Some people would describe these as kind of revelations or epiphanies or mystical experiences. You call them unusual psychic encounters or experiences, but there were a series of them that seemed to kind of foretell or presage, a deep spiritual insights that she later expressed in her books. Um,
Well, it's yes, it's hard to know. Now, there were three that she actually wrote about. Whether there were more, who knows? Um, yeah, yeah.
well, could you maybe describe the most famous of them, the third one in the subway, the underground?
Well, yes. Now, by that time, she was a young woman of about 20 or 21, and she was scraping out a living in London. And she was on the underground train. And if you know London at all, and going into what they call the underground, which in North America is known as a subway train, the crowds are thick. And so she was crowded on this train. It was rush hour. And um, all of a sudden, she didn't see what she saw was a sea of what she described as Christ. She would later describe it as the mystical body, what later became known as the mystical body of Christ. And so that was how she viewed it. And this this became a focus for her, the way she viewed people. People became Christ. Uh, with the beginning of World War II, she writes somewhere, and I think it is in a piece that she wrote in the Grail magazine. She writes, "Now is the time for us to claim our Christhood." I'm not sure if that's exactly, but she uses the word Christhood. And she's using that in the sense that we are all going to suffer. She was now living in London, where she lived her whole adult life. And as the war approached, so the late 30s, there were signs that things were getting worse, getting worse. Everyone was being issued gas masks. They were building shelters. And she became more and more terrified, but also more and more convinced that they were going to be living out the sufferings of Christ. And that is a kind of what entered into her writing.
I find that striking. One could compare this, and I know you've written about Thomas Merton, of course, to his famous experience on the corner of Fourth and Walnut that he describes, where he suddenly looked around and he realized he loved all these people, that they were all one, that they were all kind of shining like the sun, and uh,
Yes.
and it and it and you could say, well, it was an interesting experience he had, or he perceived it that way, and yet it did have fruit in his life, and that after that his writing and his spiritual writing kind of took a very decided turn toward engagement with the world, whereas previously he'd been this immersed in this very ascetic and kind of medieval life as a Trappist monk. And it seemed to
Hmm.
me that there was, almost the language was very similar with Houselander describing that experience in the underground, where she looked around everywhere she saw Christ, and she said this lasted for like a few days. She came, Christ was everywhere, and that could be, you could say, well, that was an interesting, unusual experience she had. But like the experience she had as a child of seeing the crown of thorns on this nun, it really did form, the foundation of her deep spirituality as expressed in her adult writing, this idea of our all being members of the mystical body and bearing Christ in the world and participating in Christ's passion in the sufferings of World War II. And she's living there in the Blitz, with buildings blown up all around her. Even her books were published by Sheldon Ward, and I was really interested to see even that their publishing house was obliterated in one of the bombings.
Right.
So that experience of the war was very present to people living in London at the time. So let's go back a little
Oh,
bit.
indeed.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
she's kind of making her way, as an artist, doing a lot of kind of church art and decoration, and she begins writing these articles for Catholic magazines. And it was not till she was, what, about 40 or so that she published her first book. Is that right? Or um, something like that. I mean, she'd had
All
kind of a
right.
long life of relative obscurity, and suddenly
Yeah, she's in
she
her late
became,
30s. That's right. She was discovered by Maisie Ward,
yes.
actually, through her writing in the Grail. And it was the writing about the war,
Mhm.
and we are all Christ. We are all suffering the sufferings of Christ. And that's what impressed Maisie Ward.
Well, and
Um,
a lot of readers too. Their books were fantastically successful, at least for Sheldon Ward.
yes, yeah,
Uh,
for sure. Yeah, yeah.
and one of the outcomes of that is that suddenly all these people are reaching out to her and writing her letters, and she has this kind of sort of apostolate of friendship uh, with all kinds of people who felt that she had something to offer them, right?
Well, and even people around her. After I after I wrote the book, I came upon a letter that she wrote to a young friend, and I just from the tenor of the letter, it strikes me that this may have been this even a prostitute or a woman who lived on the street, um, who talked to her about her wicked ways. That this woman had, whatever her problems were, is unknown. Um, but what Caryll what Caryll writes to her, and I so wish that I had noticed the letter beforehand. I'd love to have used it as a quote, because what Caryll is basically saying to her in this letter is how much God loves you.
Mhm.
And and she says something along the lines of, you, no matter how wicked no matter how wickeder you become, um, God is always going to love you. Uh, and so it was all kinds of people who whom she touched in one way or another, both in her person and also through her writing.
I think I read something somewhere where she said she was particularly drawn to sinners because their soul was like the tomb where Jesus was buried, which could potentially become the site of his resurrection, something like that. Um,
Okay, yes, yes.
that idea again of deep identification with Christ in the world and the vocation of lay people in particular was the subject of, I guess, her second book, The Reed of God, about Mary, and she has a very unusual and interesting way of writing about Mary and her significance for all of our vocations as Christ bearers in the world. Uh, did I get that right?
Yes, I've written down um I've written down a quote from the Reed of God, and because I was thinking of a letter that she received from probably the best known priest in England at the time. His name was Monsignor Ronald Knox.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, she didn't know Monsignor Knox at all. They lived in entirely different worlds. He was a friend of aristocrats, and he was a good friend of the novelist Evelyn Waugh. But after she published The Reed of God, he wrote her a letter and told her how much he received from this letter, and or how much he received from this book. And he quotes the actual part that impressed him. And he writes, this is the section where Jesus is lost in the temple. And Ronald Knox quotes, "The lyrical young Christ that was the youth of our soul has gone away, leaving us a dyspeptic old man, lonely in a cluttered room of his own making, a forgotten invalid sitting in a timeless twilight of mediocrity." Which says a lot about him, about this very highly placed priest, and also his own simplicity in writing to the author of that book. But yes, it shows the kind of way that she had in really in reflecting on scripture herself.
Mm. Mm. One of the things reading your book really brought out for me was how much relationships were important in her life. Uh, Family members, friends, people that she had difficult relationships with, even over long periods of time, people that she became kind of infatuated with. Um, Early in her life, when during a kind of time when she was kind of drifting away from the church, she had some kind of deep relationship with a famous spy, Sidney Riley. There was a PBS series about him called the Ace of Spies, who then
Right.
died in Russia. I guess we don't know all the details of what that was about. She seemed like a very unusual person for him to show an interest in, but there was definitely some kind of attraction.
Mhm.
And then he he went off to do his spy thing, and he died in Russia. And I read somewhere there was a line that was very beautiful that she said, what did she say? Because I loved that man, I've loved many other people, animals, and things. Um, and it reminded me a little bit also of kind of Dorothy Day and the experience for her of being in love with a man that resulted in having a child uh, and their separation. But her feeling that she didn't look back on that as, oh, I was a terrible sinner back then or something like that. It was more a sense of how God was present even in the in the experience of love and of that kind of sense of aliveness that she had, and I had the sense that Caryll Houselander also kind of brought all the experiences of her life, not just the precious kind of holy kind of things, but all the broken pieces that she carried with her, and that was part of her capacity for deep identification, sympathy with other people.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. She people remembered her um, as being very alive, having a wonderful sense of humor, um, a quick ability to a very quick ability for repartee.
Mm-hmm.
And this comes through in particular, and maybe only in her book, The Dry Wood. And The Dry Wood is the only piece of fiction that she wrote. And it's a book that I recommend, that I do recommend in order to get to know Caryll Houselander better, because her caustic sense of humor comes through so clearly,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that it doesn't in any of her other books. She has uh, wonderful dialogue. She has it's in one sense it's a pious book. It's about the the setting is a fictional parish in the East End of London, so it's a poor parish, and a saintly pastor has died, and everybody wants to make him a saint, and they want to make him a saint by using a small boy who is dying. They want to have a miracle. And different people in the parish and even the bishop have different reasons for wanting this miracle to happen. And in the course of this, you really do see she's got people's personalities down pretty clearly, and she's got the clergy down pretty well. So that's very interesting. There was nothing pious about
Mm-hmm.
her, about Caryll. And this really does come through in that book. The book did not get good reviews at the time because as fiction, you kind of have some questions about it, because there's certain amount of piety does come through, but it shines in the light of the small child
Mm-hmm.
who is dying, and and so I think the book is really worth a read. And in fact, The Dry Wood was first in a new series that the Catholic University Press brought out 2 years ago. And The Dry Wood was the first in that series. And the series is called, I think I've got it written here, The Forgotten Women of the Catholic Literary Revival.
Mm-hmm.
So Caryll Houselander's The Dry Wood is the first of that series.
Mm-hmm. How would you say people remember Caryll Houselander, or the audience for her writing today?
Well, I met a woman a couple of days ago who reads the Read of God every Advent.
Mm.
It's a wonderful Advent read. Um, and there's a number of her sayings that are really memorable. The
We
Read of God is certainly one that I recommend, but I do also highly recommend The Dry Wood, knowing that it's a piece of writing of the time, but also you get a sense of her own spiritual sense as well as her wonderful sense of humor.
Did you find I think one of the challenges of writing a biography Caryll Houselander is that according to some people, she was not necessarily the most reliable recorder of her own story or of facts in general, that she was kind of famous for embellishing things. Someone said that her account of facts, with her, they hadn't gone through the formality of taking place.
Of having
It
taken
was great.
place. Yeah.
And her, even was it her brother or brother-in-law or whoever who wrote a letter complaining about the publication of her memoir, Rocking Horse
That was her
Catholic,
brother-in-law.
yes, or her brother-in-law, that saying
Yeah.
that you basically shouldn't believe anything she says, and her family will all say the same thing. So there were
Yes, they did not no, they were not happy having a Rocking Horse Catholic published.
right, yes.
Mhm.
But so your book is really the first, I think, since Macy Ward's, really the first biography of her.
Yes.
Is that
Well,
right?
Maisie had, of course, all of Caryll's friends to talk to.
Right, right. What inspired you to, or your interest to take this up now?
It began as a project of a friend of mine who was a medieval scholar. Her name was Margot King, and Margot saw it. Margot's own area of study was some of the women of the Middle Ages, and she saw Caryll's work as very much in that tradition, and she began research to write a biography, but her health failed,
Hmm.
and she wasn't able to continue it. And after her death, I continued having an interest in it. I was able to meet two of her grandnieces, two of Caryll's grandnieces. I visited her grave, and I walked the streets of London where she lived. Um, and during the pandemic, her son, who had all of this is Margot's son now, who had all of Margot's research material, he gave me permission to use it all. So that it was basically a pandemic project for
Hmm.
me.
Hmm. Well,
Yeah.
I neglected to mention right at the outset that your book just won the first place prize in biography from the Association of Catholic Publishers.
Yeah.
So our timing is very good there, and I I really do hope that this will spur greater interest in Houselander. Uh, if I can plug another Orbis book, we also published an anthology of the essential spiritual writings of Caryll Houselander in our Modern Spiritual Masters series, edited by Wendy Wright, which has been quite
Yes.
successful. But I think that that she's such a compelling and fascinating person. It's interesting that you mentioned Margot King's work, because she did a lot of work on Beguines and medieval mystics, and it is, these are people we know pretty much just from their writings, and you would form a certain kind of impression of Houselander if you only read her books. But to discover this very salty, character with her off-color jokes and her taste for gin and smoking cigarettes and mimicry and all of that sort of thing, it gives you a different kind of impression. And I could well imagine that she would have a lot in common. It'd be very interesting to see a soiree with some of those Beguine mystics of the 14th century or whatever. Um, well, thank you very much, Mary. Lovely to talk with you about your book, Caryll Houselander, a biography. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and hope everyone will learn more about this very fascinating divine eccentric. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert.